Margaret never planned to leave her house that weekend. She thought she would spend quiet evenings with a book, waiting for her husband David to return from his work trip. He had flown to Toronto for a conference, something he still did often, even though he was close to retirement. Margaret had grown used to his absences over the years, though each time he left, she felt the house sink into silence. The phone rang early that morning. It was her daughter Claire, her voice heavy with exhaustion. She asked if Margaret could watch Ethan, her teenage son, for the weekend. Claire had to attend an unexpected work assignment out of town, and her husband was also away. Margaret agreed right away. She loved her grandson, though she sometimes wondered if he enjoyed spending time with her as much as she enjoyed having him around. At his age, he often seemed more interested in his phone than in family conversations. By the time Ethan arrived with his backpack slung over his shoulder, the weather outside had already begun to shift. Clouds rolled over the city, heavy and dark, and a biting wind rattled the windows. Margaret offered him a cup of hot chocolate, which he accepted politely, though he quickly returned his attention to his phone. She smiled quietly. Teenagers never changed, she thought. That evening, as the storm grew louder, power flickered and then went out completely. The house fell into darkness, the heater stopped, and the silence felt unsettling. Margaret pulled blankets over the sofa and tried to make it feel like an adventure for Ethan, but she could see he was restless. The city was not safe in storms like these. Trees often came down and roads became slippery. Margaret thought quickly. A memory surfaced. There was a small lakeside hotel about an hour's drive away, a place she and David had visited years ago. It was simple but cozy, with a warm fireplace and sturdy walls. They had stayed there on one of their early anniversaries, back when everything between them was new and alive. Margaret had not been back since. The thought of it now made her heart stir, though she told herself it was only practical. They needed light, heat, and safety. "Ethan," she said, "we're going to stay at a hotel tonight. It'll be fun, like a little trip." He looked up, surprised. "Now, in this weather?" "Yes, before the roads get worse. Pack your things. We'll leave soon." He shrugged, but there was a spark of interest in his eyes. A hotel stay, even for one night, felt like a small adventure to him. Margaret quickly gathered their coats and essentials. As she locked the door behind them, the storm growled above, but she felt a strange sense of determination. Something told her this trip would be more than just shelter. The drive was difficult. Rain turned to sleet, and the wipers worked hard to clear the windshield. Ethan sat quietly beside her, earbuds in, staring at the blur of lights and shadows outside. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't nervous. She had driven in worse, but her mind drifted. She remembered the first time she and David had driven this same road together. They were younger then, their conversations endless, filled with laughter and plans. She wondered when those talks had stopped, when silence had slowly replaced them. By the time they reached the hotel, night had fully settled in. The sign out front glowed softly in the storm. Margaret parked the car, exhaled, and felt relief wash over her. Inside, the lobby was warm, with the faint smell of wood polish and fresh coffee. The sound of crackling logs came from the fireplace, and a few other guests sat nearby with mugs in hand. Margaret checked them in while Ethan wandered toward the fire. He looked around with curiosity, his phone finally forgotten for the moment. She noticed how grown he seemed, taller, more thoughtful. No longer the little boy who once clung to her hand at grocery stores. It startled her, the way time moved without her noticing. Their room was simple but welcoming, with 2 beds and a window overlooking the snowy lake. Margaret set down her bag and looked out at the view. Snowflakes swirled in the light of the street lamps, settling gently on the frozen water. It was the same lake she and David once walked beside, hand in hand, when their love felt like the center of the world. Standing there now, she felt both warmth and ache. Ethan noticed her quietness. "This place is nice," he said, trying to fill the silence. "Yes," Margaret replied softly. "It brings back memories." He didn't press her further, but she saw the way he glanced at her, as though he understood more than she gave him credit for. They went down later to sit by the fire. Other guests chatted softly, and the storm outside beat against the windows. Margaret sipped tea, letting the warmth seep through her. For the first time in a long while, she felt herself pause. No chores, no routines. No empty house waiting for her, just the flicker of firelight and the sound of Ethan's laughter as he told her about his favorite shows and friends. Margaret listened carefully, realizing she had missed these conversations. She often thought teenagers didn't want to talk, but maybe they just needed the right moment. Tonight, something about the storm, the hotel, and the closeness between them made words come easier. But even as she smiled at him, Margaret's thoughts returned to David. She wondered if he was sitting in a bright conference room at that very moment, surrounded by colleagues, his mind far from her. She wondered if he thought of her the way she thought of him. The longing inside her felt sharper than usual. And she quickly looked away from the fire, hiding it from Ethan. Later, in bed, she lay awake listening to the storm. Ethan slept peacefully, his face relaxed in the soft glow of the lamp. Margaret turned toward the window, watching the snow drift across the lake. It was strange how a simple change of place could awaken so much memories she hadn't touched in years. Feelings she thought had grown quiet. She closed her eyes, trying to rest. But a thought lingered. Maybe this hotel, this storm, and this unexpected weekend would open more than just old memories. Maybe it would force her to face the silence she had been living with for far too long. And as the wind howled outside, Margaret couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting for her here, something she hadn't expected at all. The morning after they arrived, Margaret woke to the sound of wind brushing against the windows. She opened the curtains, and the lake stretched out before her, frozen and quiet, with snowflakes still falling gently from the sky. The world outside seemed untouched, a white canvas waiting for stories. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the calm settle inside her. Ethan was still asleep, his hair messy, his arm thrown over the blanket. He looked younger in sleep, reminding Margaret of when he was small and would nap on her couch after playing in the garden. She smiled faintly, then turned away before the nostalgia grew too heavy. Downstairs, the lobby was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread. Margaret poured herself a cup, sat near the fire, and let her mind wander. The last time she had been in this place, she had been with David. She remembered the way he had held her hand as they walked by the lake, whispering promises about the future. They had been so certain then, so alive with possibility. She wondered where all of that had gone. Ethan joined her a little later, still half asleep but curious. "This hotel feels old but kinda nice," he said, looking around. "It's been here for a long time," Margaret replied. "Your grandfather and I stayed here once, many years ago." He looked at her with interest. "When you were my age?" Margaret laughed softly. "Not quite. We were newly married then, still figuring out life, still learning each other." Something in her voice made Ethan pause. He sat down beside her, folding his hands as though waiting for more. Margaret felt his quiet attention, and against her usual instinct to keep her heart guarded, she began to talk. She told him about her early days with David, how they had dreamed of traveling the world, how they had promised to never let work come between them. She spoke of the small apartment they once shared, the way they used to cook together, laugh over nothing, and talk until sunrise. She told him how those years had slowly changed as responsibilities piled up, as bills and deadlines replaced laughter and long talks. Ethan listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like someone was really hearing her. She hadn't planned to share so much, but the words came easily, as though the walls she had built over decades were softening in the glow of the fire. When she stopped, Ethan said quietly, "Grandma, you sound sad about it." Margaret looked at him, surprised by his bluntness. "I suppose I am," she admitted. "It's not that I don't love your grandfather. I do. But sometimes love changes in ways you don't expect. You think it will always feel the same, but life has a way of shifting things." Ethan nodded slowly, as though he understood more than his age should allow. "But you stayed. You didn't give up." "Yes," Margaret said, her voice soft. "Because love isn't only about passion. It's about patience, loyalty, and commitment. Still, sometimes I miss the way it used to feel." The fire cracked gently in front of them, filling the silence that followed. Margaret felt her throat tighten. It had been so long since she admitted those feelings aloud, even to herself. Sharing them with her grandson felt both strange and healing. Later, they decided to walk through the hallways of the hotel. The old carpets, the framed black and white photos, the scent of pine wood polish, it all carried her back in time. She paused at a window overlooking the lake, her breath fogging the glass. She could almost see her younger self there, laughing in David's arms, her heart full of hope. "Did you and Grandpa fight much?" Ethan asked. Suddenly, Margaret thought carefully before answering. "Not at first. We were too busy being in love. But over the years, yes, we had arguments. Sometimes small, sometimes bigger. Marriage isn't easy, Ethan. It's about learning to forgive, even when it hurts. But the hardest part isn't fighting, it's when you stop talking. That's when distance creeps in." Ethan looked at her seriously. "Do you think Grandpa knows how you feel now?" Margaret's chest tightened. She wasn't sure. She rarely spoke of her loneliness, and David rarely asked. His work kept him away, and when he was home, conversations often revolved around daily routines. She wanted to tell him, but years of silence had made it difficult. Instead of answering, she placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You'll understand more when you're older. But remember this, Sif, you care about someone. Don't stop talking. Don't stop seeing them." That evening, they returned to the lobby. Few families gathered near the fire, children playing with board games while adults sipped wine. Margaret and Ethan found a quiet corner. She watched the flames dance, her heart restless. Something about this place kept stirring her memories, her longing. Her unspoken questions about her own marriage. Ethan noticed her silence again. "Grandma," he asked softly, "are you unhappy?" Margaret turned to him, startled. She had never expected such a direct question from him. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure of how much truth to give. But his eyes were steady, waiting. "I'm not unhappy," she said finally, her voice low, "but I'm not complete either. Sometimes I feel like a part of me is missing, the part that used to laugh, dream, and feel alive. I love your grandfather, but I miss being truly seen." Ethan didn't look away. He reached out and took her hand, a simple gesture, but one that made her heart swell. "I see you, Grandma," he whispered. The words hit her harder than she expected. She blinked back sudden tears, squeezing his hand gently. No one had said that to her in years. Not even David. As the night grew late, they returned to their room. Ethan quickly fell asleep, but Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The conversations, the memories, the feeling of being heard, it all kept her restless. She felt something shifting inside her, something she couldn't name. She thought of David, of the years they had shared, of the love that was still there but buried beneath silence and distance. She thought of how easy it had been to open up to Ethan, how natural it felt to finally speak her truth. And she wondered if she would ever have the courage to say those words to her husband. When she finally closed her eyes, Margaret knew one thing with certainty. This trip was not just about escaping a storm. It was about facing the storms within her, the quiet battles she had avoided for too long. And she sensed that the days ahead would bring answers she had not been ready to face until now. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The storm had slowed, but the sound of the wind brushing across the frozen lake was like a whisper against the glass. She got out of bed quietly so she wouldn't wake Ethan and stepped onto the small balcony outside their room. The air was sharp and cold, filling her lungs as she pulled her coat tight. The lake stretched before her, a sheet of silver under the moonlight, silent and endless. She rested her hands on the railing, her mind heavy with memories. This hotel had once been a place of joy, a beginning. Now it felt like a reminder of everything that had changed. She remembered David's voice when he was young, full of warmth and plans. She remembered how he used to hold her close, as though he could never let her go. Somewhere along the way, those gestures had faded. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. As if love had slipped into the background of their lives. A shiver went through her, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the ache of longing. She wanted to feel alive again, wanted to feel like someone truly saw her. She wasn't sure if that was too much to ask at her age. But the emptiness she carried told her it wasn't something she could ignore forever. She didn't hear Ethan at first, but then a soft voice came from behind. "Grandma, what are you doing out here?" She turned, startled, to see him standing in the doorway with a blanket draped over his shoulders. He stepped forward and gently wrapped it around her too. "You looked cold," he said, his tone quiet, almost protective. Margaret managed a smile. "Thank you, dear." "I just couldn't sleep." He leaned on the railing beside her, his eyes on the frozen lake. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, almost tender. Then Ethan asked, "Do you miss Grandpa right now?" The question cut deep. Margaret took a breath. "I do, but not the way you think. I miss the version of him that used to be here with me. The man who laughed with me, who dreamed with me. I miss feeling like his world, like I mattered most." Ethan frowned slightly. "But you still love him, right?" "Yes," she whispered. "Love doesn't just vanish, but sometimes it changes. Sometimes it feels more like duty than passion. And when that happens, it can be very lonely." Her voice trembled, and to her surprise, Ethan reached for her hand. His grip was steady, his expression serious, far beyond his years. "You haven't disappeared, Grandma," he said softly. "You're still here. You're still you." The word struck her like a spark in the dark. She blinked, her throat tightening, her eyes burning with sudden tears. No one had reminded her of that in so long, not even David. She looked at Ethan and saw not just her grandson, but a kind soul who noticed her pain when others overlooked it. For a moment, standing there under the moonlight, she felt both fragile and alive. His words carried her back to a younger self. The woman who once believed she could light up a room. The woman who had dreams of her own. That woman was still inside hers, waiting to be seen again. They stood together in silence, watching the icy shimmer of the lake. Thought about how easily life could pass by without realizing what was slipping away. She thought about how long she had been quiet, how long she had carried her longing alone. Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think Grandpa would understand if you told him all this?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he's too far away. Not in miles, but here." She touched her chest lightly. "Too far from my heart." Ethan's eyes softened. "Maybe he just needs reminding." Margaret let out a quiet laugh, though it was tinged with sadness. "Perhaps, or maybe I need reminding." "Tonight, you've done that for me," he gave her. Hand another squeeze, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly seen, truly valued. It wasn't romantic love, this was something different, something healing. But it stirred something inside her all the same. When they went back inside, Margaret lay awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep again. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts circling. She realized she was standing at a turning point in her life. The storm outside wasn't the only storm she had to face. The real storm was inside her heart, in the questions she had buried for too long. She thought of the years with David, the countless nights waiting for him to come home. The small smiles exchanged across dinner tables, the long silences that had become normal. She loved him, but love without closeness felt like a shadow of what it once was. Could she live like this for the rest of her life? Could she stay silent forever? The balcony moment with Ethan had opened something she couldn't close again. She had been reminded that she still mattered, that her heart still longed to be seen and cherished. And once awakened, that longing would not go back to sleep. Margaret turned toward the window, watching the last flakes of snow drift down. She thought of David in Toronto, likely asleep in his hotel room, unaware of the thoughts running through her mind tonight. She wondered how he would react if she told him the truth, not anger, not betrayal. Just the truth. That she needed more, that she couldn't let the silence continue. As her eyes grew heavy, she made herself a quiet promise. She would not return home the same. She would not keep carrying her loneliness like an invisible weight. She would find a way to speak, to ask for more, even if it risked unsettling the life they had built. Because she had realized something tonight. She wasn't too old to want closeness, to want to feel alive again. And as she finally drifted into sleep, one thought lingered. Perhaps the storm hadn't pushed her into this hotel by accident. Perhaps it had carried her here to remind her that her story, her love, her heart were not finished yet. The morning came quietly, with light streaming through the curtains and spilling across the hotel room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so clear it almost looked painted. Margaret woke first. For a moment she lay still, listening to the soft rhythm of Ethan's breathing in the other bed. The peacefulness of the room wrapped around her. But so did the weight of the thoughts she had carried all night. She rose and went to the window. Outside, the frozen lake shimmered beneath the pale sun. The trees that had bent under heavy snow now stood tall again, their branches glittering like crystal. It was beautiful, but it also felt symbolic. The storm had broken. And now came the calm that asked her what she was going to do next. Margaret dressed quietly and went downstairs to the lobby. The fire had burned low, but the smell of coffee filled the space. She poured herself a cup and sat by the window, staring out at the lake. For years, she had filled her life with routines, cooking, cleaning, phone calls, small visits. She had convinced herself it was enough. But this weekend had peeled away those layers and shown her the truth. She was still a woman who longed to be loved, to be noticed, to feel alive. That truth both frightened and freed her. Ethan joined her soon after, his hair messy, his smile sleepy. "Morning, Grandma," he said, sitting down beside her. "Morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" He nodded. "Better than at home, actually. This place feels different." Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, it does." She hesitated before speaking again. "Ethan, thank you for listening to me last night. I didn't realize how much I needed to say those things out loud." He shrugged, but his eyes were warm. "Everyone needs someone to listen. Even you, Grandma. Especially you." The words touched her deeply. She reached out and brushed his hair back, realizing how quickly he was growing up. How much he reminded her of the kindness she had once fallen in love with in David. It struck her then love came in many forms. It wasn't always about romance. Sometimes it was about being reminded of who you still were through the eyes of someone who cared. They ate breakfast together. And afterward, Margaret suggested they take one last walk by the lake before heading home. Bundled in coats and scarves, they stepped onto the frozen path that circled the water. The air was crisp, and every breath felt sharp and clean. Ethan walked ahead for a bit, kicking at the snow, but he kept glancing back to make sure she was close. Margaret followed slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She remembered walking this same path years ago with David. He had told her then that no matter how busy life got, he would always choose her first. The memory ached now because somewhere along the way, he had chosen work, schedules, and responsibilities more often than her. She didn't blame him completely. Life was complicated. But she missed the man who once made her feel like the center of his world. They reached a bench near the edge of the lake. "Okay." And Margaret sat while Ethan stood looking out over the ice. He turned to her after a moment. "What will you do when Grandpa comes back?" he asked quietly. The question had been circling in her mind since the moment she arrived at the hotel. She had no easy answer, but she couldn't pretend anymore. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But I do know I can't stay silent anymore. I need to talk to him. I need him to understand what I've been carrying inside." Ethan nodded. "That sounds hard, but I think he'll listen. He has to." Margaret let out a breath, watching it rise into the cold air. "I hope so," she whispered. The walk back was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Margaret felt a calmness settling in her chest, the kind that comes after making a decision, even if the path forward is uncertain. She knew the conversation with David would not be easy. There would be questions, maybe even hurt. But silence was no longer an option. She owed it to herself and to the years they had shared to fight for closeness again when they packed their bags and checked out of the hotel. Margaret took one last look at the fireplace in the lobby. She felt as though the place had given her something priceless, not just shelter from a storm, but a mirror to her heart. She walked out with Ethan, her steps steadier than they had been when she arrived. The drive home was calmer than the night they had come. The roads were clear, the sky open, the world bright. Ethan leaned back in the seat, soon falling asleep, his head resting against the window. Margaret glanced at him and felt a swell of gratitude. He had been her companion, her listener, her reminder that love still lived in her life in ways she hadn't noticed. As the city skyline came into view, Margaret's thoughts turned to David. She pictured him returning from Toronto, tired from travel, briefcase in hand. She pictured the familiar scene of him walking through the door, her greeting him with a polite smile, both of them slipping into routine. But she knew this time it had to be different. She would not let her voice remain buried. When she parked in front of her house, she sat for a moment watching Ethan stir awake beside her. He blinked, looked around, and then smiled at her sleepily. "We're home," he said. "Yes," Margaret replied softly. "We are." But in her heart, she knew home was no longer just a place. It was something she would have to rebuild with honesty, with courage, with hope that the man she had loved for so long would still be willing to meet her there as they carried their bags inside. Margaret whispered to herself almost like a vow. "I may be older, but my story isn't finished yet." The storm had ended, but what it left behind was far more important: chance to begin again.